Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face-to-face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Today's subject is Mozart. We'll follow his story from being a rebellious prodigy child to becoming one of the most celebrated composers of all time. At the end, we'll talk about his appearance and reveal what he may have looked like. So let's go ahead and get started. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born on January 27, 1756, in what is now Salzburg, Austria, to his mother, Anna Maria, and his father, Leopold. Anna Maria was the daughter of a talented musician and city official not far from Salzburg. Leopold was supposed to become a priest, but instead fell in love with music in his teens and decided to follow his passion instead. The two met in 1747 and got married not long after. They would have two children together, a daughter, Maria Anna, born in 1751, and a son, Wolfgang, born in 1756. For the first few years of his life, Wolfgang Mozart was thought to be like any other toddler. He was very close to his older sister, whom he called Nannerl, and the two would spend all of their time together. So much so that they had invented their own language, which only the two of them understood. Leopold had found work in Salzburg, teaching music and composing for choir boys, and soon earned a reputation for being a strict but effective teacher. Because of his strict teaching style, Anna Maria made sure they waited until Nannerl was 7 years old before they would begin giving her piano lessons. But to everyone's surprise, Nannerl picked it up almost immediately, much quicker than Leopold had ever seen before. Of course, looking on was the 3-year-old Mozart, who, wanting to be just like his older sister, began to imitate her playing. But to their father's astonishment, it wasn't just the thoughtless mashing you would expect when a child plays the piano. It was the same technique that he had been teaching Nannerl. 3-year-old Wolfgang was picking out thirds on the keyboard. Leopold soon realized that Mozart understood exactly what he was doing, almost by instinct. He immediately began lessons with Wolfgang and was astonished to see him playing all of the right notes, even wincing in pain when Leopold played the wrong notes on purpose. Both children began to progress very rapidly, and by 5 years old, Mozart had begun to create his own music for the first time. What you're listening to now is Mozart's first composed piece. Not bad for a 5-year-old. By 1763, Mozart and Nannerl had reached prodigy-level skill in the piano and the harp, and Leopold decided to take the show on the road. Only 8 and 13 at the time, Leopold advertised his children by saying that Nannerl was one of the most skillful players in Europe, and that Mozart knew more in his 8th year than one would expect for a man of 40. At first, the trio would play for nobility in Salzburg, but when word spread of Mozart and Nannerl's skills, they began to receive invitations further and further from home, eventually finding themselves in Munich, Dover, Amsterdam, and Paris, even performing for King Louis XV at Versailles. But along with all the spectacle came all the travel, which has been described by historians as primitive and brutal at this time. It often exposed them to the elements for weeks on end. In 1764, Leopold became seriously ill, which caused the family to be stuck in London for months. With their father bedridden, performing was impossible. Mozart had to find something else to do. So, naturally, he decided to write his first symphony. A symphony is an elaborate piece of music that's written for at least 15 different instruments. Mozart was able to hear every single instrument in his mind, perfectly flowing together. When he was done, the piece was 13 minutes long. Mozart's Symphony No. 1 was most likely created with and transcribed by his older sister Nannerl. But she had no problem giving her younger brother the credit. Nannerl really never showed any kind of jealousy or shame over her brother's talent, mostly because she was so talented herself. But as Mozart got better and better, every compliment began to sound sort of backhanded. She has the finest and most brilliant execution on the harpsichord. No one but her brother can rob her of her supremacy. Leopold would recover from the illness. The tour across Europe would continue until 1766, and by the end, it was clear that Leopold was shifting his focus solely onto Mozart. When Nannerl turned 18, it was decided that only Leopold and Wolfgang would set off on the next tour, planned for Italy. Not because Mozart had surpassed her, but because she had reached a marriageable age and wouldn't want to intimidate a suitable heir with her artistic triumphs. Nannerl would take the news with grace, and her relationship with Wolfgang doesn't seem to be affected by this. Although there's evidence that she continued to write musical compositions, known because of letters where Wolfgang is praising her work, nothing was ever published. She continued practicing piano every day for 3 hours and would not marry until 1783, 14 years later. In December of 1769, Wolfgang and his father set out for Italy. Mozart, who was now 13, was just coming into his own. His famous cheeky and rebellious personality was beginning to develop, resulting in more headaches for Leopold, but more importantly, Wolfgang was realizing just how special he was. Although Italy was arguably the center of classical music in Europe, Mozart would send back letters to Nannerl stating that he simply wasn't impressed, bored even, at the shows he had attended at the beginning of their trip. In a concert given to the Accademia Filarmonica di Mantova, he was given a program designed to test his abilities in performance, sight reading, and improvisation. According to the press review, the audience was dumbfounded at this performance, calling him a miracle in music, one of those freaks that nature causes to be born. And they weren't wrong. What we know now is that Mozart has what's called absolute pitch, which only 0.01% of humans are born with. When Mozart heard a note, he knew exactly which note it was, what tuning it had, and along with his great memory and virtuoso skill, it allowed him to play nearly any piece back by ear almost instantaneously. One of the most famous stories about Mozart is when he and his father visited Rome and the Vatican for Easter in 1770. Wolfgang fell in love with Rome, its wonder, its energy, but as always, it was a piece of music that left its greatest impression. Miserere is a masterpiece composed by Gregorio Allegri that has been sung at the Vatican since 1514. The privilege to hear the song was only allowed to those that had made the journey to the Vatican, and in order to preserve its mystery and holiness, it was forbidden to play outside of the Vatican walls, and transcribing the piece was a crime punishable by excommunication. But for Mozart, the piece was an ethereal experience, too beautiful to be heard only once. So later that day, when he arrived home, he transcribed the 15-minute piece with all of its complexity from memory. What he was doing was illegal, but Mozart thought the band was stupid, so he didn't care. He would later sell the music to a British traveler who would take it to London to be heard for the first time. When Pope Clement XIV heard news of what Mozart had done, Wolfgang was summoned to Rome. Although they feared the worst, Leopold and Mozart made the trip anyway. But instead of receiving an excommunication, Mozart was knighted by the Pope into the Order of the Golden Spur, given to those who have contributed to the glory of the Church. The ban on the song being heard was lifted, which allows us to hear it today. After being knighted by the Pope, Mozart would be accepted into one of the most prestigious academies in Bologna and study under one of Europe's greatest music scholars, Giovanni Martini. He would be hired to compose music for 3 Italian operas and even wrote one himself. But even with the opera's success, Leopold and Mozart would leave Italy disappointed. He had hoped that someone would hire Mozart and appoint them to their court so that he could make a stable living and not have to travel anymore. But what Leopold didn't understand was that he had grown a reputation amongst the nobility of being a stage dad, always desperate to show off his son, causing the nobility to look down on the Mozarts. Maria Theresa, the Holy Roman Empress, even called the Mozarts useless people that went around the world like beggars. When Mozart and his father returned home in 1772, they learned that Leopold's employer, Prince Archbishop Schrattenbach, had died, and a new successor, Archbishop Colloredo, had been named. Colloredo would immediately hire Wolfgang. Although he was considered progressive for his time, Colloredo didn't want the complex music that Mozart was used to making. He liked his music short and sweet. Now nearly 18, Mozart was confined to writing simple church music. This work was agony for him, but on the bright side, the work was easy, which gave him a lot of time to work on other things. He would spend months perfecting his craft in his free time, writing symphonies and working with other musicians in Salzburg. He took immense inspiration from a visit to Vienna. This visit would cause him to become obsessed with violin concertos and then piano concertos, all before branching out with a comedic opera called La Finta Giardiniera, which allowed him to show his personality in the music. But even with all this stimulation, by 1777, Mozart had grown incredibly bored with his life at court in Salzburg. He was better than this. What did Archbishop Colloredo know about music anyway? Why did Mozart have to listen to him? Now, a normal person would be able to calm himself down, saying things like job security, stability, money to live off of were more important than passion. All the things that Leopold had told him many times. But Mozart wasn't just a normal person. He was different. He was special. He had already made more money than most people could make in their entire lives. He had traveled all over Europe. He had met the Pope. He was a knight. In August of 1777, with heavy disapproval from his father, Mozart would resign from his boring job in Salzburg and venture out with his mother into Europe. They would first go to Germany, to Munich, and then Mannheim. While his job prospects worked themselves out, he earned a living by teaching singing lessons to a woman named Aloysia Weber. Aloysia was instantly charmed by this talented, funny man, and over the course of their lessons, the two would fall in love, with Mozart stating in letters that he desired to marry her. But when it became clear that the Mannheim Orchestra had no openings for him, Mozart's living expenses forced him to leave Germany and Aloysia behind. Now, it wasn't like everyone was ignoring Mozart's genius. Even by now, it was pretty well recognized that Mozart was, pretty good to have around. It was more that Mozart himself was incredibly picky about where he worked. He even turned down a job with King Louis XVI and Versailles. As the time went on, Mozart's travel expenses, along with partying and poor money management, began to catch up with him, to the point where he even had to start pawning off his stuff. Finally, Mozart accepted work, although begrudgingly, in Paris. His thoughts on the French were not the best, but he was able to get over it, composing Symphony No. 31, specifically for the Parisian public, and said he was even able to keep his dignity while doing it too. But while he had been completely focused on his work, his mother, Anna Maria, had begun to feel ill. Although she isn't spoken about very much, Anna Maria was very important to Wolfgang. Where his father, Leopold, was cold and strict, Anna Maria was warm and loving. She raised Mozart in a healthy environment and was a funny, kind person who always supported him no matter what. Her illness fell directly in line with the premiere of his symphony in Paris. She assured Wolfgang to focus, that she would be all right. The premiere would be a success and bring the job offers that Mozart and the family needed. But unfortunately, his mother's illness took a turn for the worse. On July 3, 1778, Anna Maria Mozart died. The news spread to the family, causing shock and anger, particularly from his father. Mozart and his father's relationship had become strained over the years. Leopold's overbearing stage dad nature had caused Mozart to grow rebellious and impulsive. With the news of Anna Maria's death, Leopold's grief would express itself through anger, and he would blame Mozart for the death. If Mozart had just stayed at home, if he hadn't been so picky, if he had managed his money better, if he had listened to his father, then his mother would still be alive. This was, of course, incredibly unfair, but the guilt and sadness that Wolfgang already felt would compound itself at his father's accusations. Mozart would go home to Salzburg, humbled by life for the first time. For nearly 2 years, he stayed there, with nothing to take him away from his duties. Finally, in the summer of 1780, 18 months after arriving back home, Mozart was invited to write an Italian opera in Munich. With a new sense of gratitude for his work, he would spend 6 months writing 2 hours of music for the play. When Indomeneo premiered in January of 1781, it was a resounding success, and Mozart finally felt like himself again. He would spend his free time in Munich rubbing shoulders with the nobility, playing billiards, partying, and showing off. But this time in Munich also reignited his drive to leave Salzburg for good. Any success that Mozart had was also partly shared with his employer, Colloredo, who began to take advantage of Mozart's fame. He began to take Mozart along with him in his travels in order to show him off to other nobility. And in 1781, Colloredo brought Mozart to Vienna to celebrate the beginning of the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II's solo reign. What he didn't know was that Mozart had a plan to seize the moment for himself. In a letter to his father, he said, "My main goal right now is to meet the emperor in some agreeable fashion. I'm absolutely determined that he should get to know me. I'd be so happy if I could whip through my opera for him and then play a fugue or two, for that's what he likes." At one of these events, Mozart was allowed to play for the emperor and meet him afterwards. Joseph II was so impressed with Mozart that he offered him a huge sum to stay at the court and play for him again. But there was one problem. Colloredo obviously realized that Mozart was a huge draw, and he could see a future where Mozart would bring people from far and wide to Salzburg. So he decided the best course of action would be to ban Mozart from performing anywhere but at his court. And it didn't matter who was asking or how much Mozart would get paid. The only thing Colloredo didn't account for was just how little Mozart cared about his opinion. Wolfgang immediately abandoned Colloredo, vowing that he would rather starve and be homeless than go back to Salzburg. In letters, Colloredo and Mozart would trade insult for months, until the summer of 1781, when, according to Mozart, Archbishop Colloredo used ungodly language and finally fired him. He was finally free from his miserable life in Salzburg, and this time he wasn't going back. In Vienna, Mozart had found a place to live with the Weber family. Although Aloysia was now married, Mozart still had a good relationship with the rest of the family. But rumors began to spread all the way to Leopold in Salzburg that Mozart had fallen in love with the third Weber daughter, Constanze. Although Mozart would at first deny any relationship to his father, by December he had confessed that he had in fact fallen in love with the other Weber daughter. Both Leopold and Constanze's mother were furious and refused to give Mozart any kind of blessing. Mozart would be made to leave their home, but the two continued their courtship. As much as it's said that Mozart was rebellious and detached, he still cared deeply about his father's approval, and this period marked a low point for their relationship. Over the next 6 months, Mozart would plead with his father to please accept his love for Constanze. When she decided to move in with him, it created a crisis within the two families. Constanze's mother declared that she would send the police after her daughter if she didn't leave Mozart and return home. But the couple remained stubborn. On August 4th, 1782, Mozart sent one last letter to his father, saying, "Can the police here enter anyone's house in this way? Perhaps it is only a ruse of Madame Weber to get her daughter back. If not, I know no better remedy than to marry Constanze tomorrow morning, or if possible, today." They were married that same day. With his life settled in Vienna, Mozart began arguably the best years of his life. He was constantly writing and working, appearing in over 22 concerts in just over a month. When he wasn't working, he was socializing, making friends with intellectuals like Gottfried van Swieten and genius composers like Joseph Haydn. By 1785, Mozart had come into his own and was becoming very popular. In typical Wolfgang fashion, instead of booking busy theaters, he would instead play concerts in an apartment building or a restaurant, making his concerts feel intimate and captivating. These concerts made Mozart a substantial amount of money, and he began to live his life extravagantly. Before long, these expenses caught up with him. So in order to keep living his lavish lifestyle, he would have to put his money where his mouth was and produce something amazing. In 1786, he did just that. Mozart would compose The Marriage of Figaro, now seen as one of his greatest works. That December, Emperor Joseph II would appoint Mozart to his royal court. He had finally secured himself the prestigious court position that his father had worked and hoped for since Mozart was only 5 years old. Despite their disagreements, their fights, and their pride getting in the way of their relationship, Mozart always knew that all his father ever wanted for him was to live the best life he could. In late May 1787, Mozart came home to a letter. His father, Leopold, was dead. Although he now had an appointed position with Emperor Joseph II, war would break out in Europe in 1788, and the nobility shifted focus entirely away from the arts. His family would have to move to the suburbs, hoping to cut expenses, but Mozart still ended up having to borrow money from friends. These two events were devastating for Mozart, and it's believed he fell into a deep depression. But like many other artists, his sadness brought out a certain quality in his work that he'd never had before. During this time, Mozart would go on to write some of his most famous works, like his Symphony No. 41, Jupiter. This piece is regarded by many critics as the greatest symphony of all time. Thankfully, he was commissioned to write 2 plays that would premiere in September of 1791. With this money, he was able to pay his friends back, and was finally feeling more optimistic about the future. But during his travels to Prague for the premiere of the first opera, La Clemenza di Tito, Mozart began to feel ill. Like many times before, he would ignore it and continue working through the premiere of the second opera, The Magic Flute. It would be his last performance. Growing sicker and sicker, Mozart continued trying to work. And as his health failed him, he wrote one final piece, Requiem, calling it that because he feared he was writing a requiem for himself. The piece is powerful and especially haunting when you consider that it was written by a genius at the peak of his abilities who was able to perfectly express emotion best through his music. You can almost feel his fear, his anxiety about the end, as it becomes all-consuming. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died on December 5th, 1791, at the age of only 35. The cause of his death is still unknown to this day, leading some to believe that he was poisoned by his rivals. Although he died so young, Mozart wrote more than 800 works. He is seen as one of the greatest composers of all time. So what did Mozart really look like? Well, his true appearance is surprisingly contentious. He's even been described as the most famous person whose true likeness is the least recognized. All of his portraits look a little different. His family members as well as historians have commented on this. His sister said that she had never seen so many portraits of her brother that were so different when seen side by side, but that nevertheless all looked like him. Alfred Einstein, a Mozart specialist, said, "We have nothing to give us an idea of Mozart's physical appearance, except for a few mediocre canvases that don't even resemble each other." So what then is his true appearance? Well, let's start with some portraits that were created during his lifetime. This Della Croce portrait of the Mozart family was made from life around 1780 and gives us a good look at the young Wolfgang. He's also seen here in the Bologna portrait, and shockingly, he's only 14 in this image. His father said his son was ill the day this portrait was painted, and that it wasn't even a good work of art, but he also added that it looked very much like him. Another is this unfinished image made by Mozart's brother-in-law, which Mozart's wife said was the most accurate image she had seen, but somehow looks the most different from all the others. We know some details from the people he lived and worked with. A colleague named Michael Kelly said that Mozart was very thin and pale, and had abundant dark blonde hair. He was very fond of billiards and always won, drank punch with little moderation, and was a kind-hearted man with a good sense of humor. We also know that he had large blue eyes, a strong nose, and a head that was considered too big for his body. He was considered to be a sickly child. He'd had smallpox in his youth, which marked his face, and he suffered from poor dental health and toothaches. His poor health, I suspect, is the reason he always looks much older than his years in some of these portraits. His friends said that Mozart knew he was a man who wasn't exceptionally attractive, so he made up for it by wearing luxurious clothing and always caring meticulously about his appearance. One small indicator of possible self-consciousness is that we don't see his left ear in any paintings. You see, he had a defect of the left ear, which we now refer to as Mozart ear, that changed the shape quite drastically. He even made this watercolor image of it himself. I'm going to use the best quality image we have of Mozart to bring him to life. This 1819 version by Barbara Kraft. While it was not made from life, Kraft actually worked closely with Mozart's sister on this version to create a kind of definitive likeness, kind of like what I try to do these days. She used 3 faithful works as models for this image. Kraft and Nannerl agreed that Mozart hadn't been painted by the most talented artists of his time. They wanted to have a good portrait of him. So, let's check out my recreation of the prodigy musician now. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you for the next video.